Hi there, my name's Cameron Freeman, and I'm going to be giving a couple of talks this evening. One on Jack Caputo's radical theology, and another on Slavoj Žižek's sort of materialist, death of God theology. And my voice is a bit echoey. It's only because I'm doing this from inside a cubicle in a lodgings in the CBD of Sydney, where I've just arrived to spend some time with Pete Rowlands over the next few days. So I'll see how this comes out. If it sounds okay, I'll post it. And first of all, we're going to start with Jack Caputo, who is a pretty formative influence on my own work. And his radical theology does have some pretty deep implications for how we are to live out faith, the life of faith in the 21st century. And he really does go a long way towards helping us reconceive or reimagine what religion is in this day and age. So he's primarily writing for those who sort of live somewhere between belief and skepticism, or between faith and doubt, or between theism and atheism. Those who live in that space between and yet feel an unconditional call that they're sort of compelled by, that will not let them go. So firstly, Caputo's primary influence is Jacques Derrida and his philosophical movement known as deconstruction, which I won't be going into too much tonight, except to say that deconstruction is not, as is widely presumed, a negative mode or movement. It's actually an affirmation. Deconstruction is an affirmation of the future, an affirmation of what is yet to come, the future as a kind of transforming surprise. So yes, in many ways we deconstruct in order to keep the future open. And we deconstruct the name of God in order to open up a future for the name of God. So as just a general statement about the underlying thrust of or impulse of Jack's radical theology, or his philosophical publications in general, he really is just wanting to describe the original difficulty of life after the death of God, which is also could be framed as after the end of metaphysics, which means after the end of any ultimate guarantee of truth, meaning, purpose, and so forth. So instead of trying to escape from the difficulty of life through various forms of security, certainty, safety that come with metaphysics and theology, the basic task of this radical or deconstructive approach to theology is to kind of expose us to the trembling in things and the shaking of the foundations. As a very pithy summary of the work of Jack Caputo, I'd say that he's probably really just saying that faith means you are not safe. He's also writing for the radical theologians to come, which means, again, if there's a future for God, it's to the degree that an event is possible that can disturb the peace of our traditional formal religious confessions. So again, it's just important to remember that deconstruction is not a negative term. It's actually what keeps the future open. It stops things from closing down on themselves and becoming too rigid or ossified. And so we deconstruct the name of God to keep a future open for God, to keep hope alive. Now, there's a pretty fundamental distinction at the heart of Caputo's theological works, and that's a distinction between radical theology and confessional theology. So I'll just unpack that briefly. Radical theology is a theological approach that's not really tied to any congregation or denomination or sanctioning body. So there is a freedom here in not being anchored to any confessional formal religious approach, and that allows radical theologians to sort of be more daring, innovative. They can engage with contemporary schools of thought, and largely without consequences or consideration for how this will impact existing faith communities, at least not initially. So yeah, there's a very exploratory, innovative, and adventurous kind of open-endedness to radical theology. On the other hand, confessional theology is an approach that is rooted in a historic tradition and a local expression of that tradition. So confessional theology takes a very classical perspective and tries to maybe update a tradition, or perhaps return to some previous incarnation of it in order to find a pure expression. But there is an acceptable orthodoxy and praxis that goes with it. So I guess we could say that confessional theology says you've built a lovely house. Radical theology would come along and say, yes, but you are right above a fault line. So again, the confessional theology works with names, the name of God, Yahweh, Allah. Radical theology is interested in events, and events that haunt or spook these confessions. In this sense, radical theology is often framed as parasitic to confessional theology because it does disrupt, scandalise, haunt or spook. It works from the margins to kind of unsettle the established forms and structures. But in this sense, radical theologians do reserve the right to ask any question. So confessional theology is accountable to a tradition and its authorities, and there are usually places in confessional theology where there's a conversation stopper, there's a line is drawn and certain questions can't be asked and so forth. So in this sense, Jack Caputo wants to start with confessional theologies but then expose them and us to its own excess. So he wants to hold us open to the events that they contain. And we'll go into what Jack means by event shortly. And the basic approach here is sort of just to destabilise our favourite binary oppositions or twosomes, to cut across these conventional distinctions that sort of define the discourse that we have between theism, atheism, or belief and doubt, or liberal, conservative, and so forth. So a radical theology refuses to let these established binaries settle into place. So we'll talk briefly about Caputo's first major theological work called The Weakness of God. We'll follow that up with a bit of a summary of his second major work, The Insistence of God, and then we'll talk about what Derrida calls a religion without religion might look like, or an A/theism might look like. It's just drawing out some of the implications of this work in the context of practicing communities, alternative forms of religious life and so forth. So, name and event. For Caputo, God is not a being that does things, neither a highest being nor a supreme being. God is the name of an event. Okay, so the basic move here is to shift away from the God of confessional theology as a all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent being, to a radical theology of the event that's going on in the name of God. So Jack wants to know what's going on in the name of God. So the event isn't what happens, the event is what's going on in what happens, in the traditions, in the memory of Jesus, for instance. So the name of God, or Jesus, or Allah, is the name that shelters an event. And I guess for the most part, the event for Jack, for Caputo, is the event that's simmering away within these names is a call, or a promise, or an invitation. So names contain events. These events are described as a call, or a provocation, or an invitation by Jack. But there's a very important point to be underlined here, and that is this call, this promise that's sheltered in the name of God. It cannot be held captive by the name. We cannot build a wall or a doctrine of orthodoxy around these names, around these events. I'm sorry. Again, names contain events, but the events are uncontainable. Events make the name of God restless. They cannot be tracked by confessional theology or creedal formula. So our events are what happens to us. They're the things that overtake us. They are like an excess or an overflow that breaks apart our ordered, safe, settled world. These events, they interrupt the closed circles where meaning and so forth is already secured. So again, events make the name of God restless, which means when we do speak the name of God, what we're doing is really an unsettling or destabilising act that exposes us to something that's on the tip of our tongue, something that sort of slips out of grasp, incomprehensible. In other words, it's precisely when I'm lost for words and when I do not know the name that when I do not know the name of what it is I desire. It's precisely then that I'm fired up white hot by this passion for the impossible. Just one moment, have a quick drink. I can give you a bit of an example of this distinction between name and event. So what's going on in the name of God? Again, God is the name of an event, which is that which haunts us, a provocation that disturbs and upsets our self-image, and it's an event or a visitation that confuses the whole of one's speech and imagery. It interrupts our business as usual world, kind of reorganises the landscape of our lives in very unpredictable ways. So again, what these events are can vary incalculably. It could be a debilitating sickness, it could be artistic inspiration in tune with the sort of the creative rhythm of things, it could be the irreconcilable pain and loss and heartache of a lost love. It could be the unexpected chance of new life. It could be the dark night of truth and sort of this madness of not knowing who we are. It could be an intuitive breakthrough of an all-at-once apprehension. It could be an encounter with the strangeness of a world that's beyond our control and understanding. Perhaps it could be a mystical experience that leaves us speechless, or it could be an overwhelming beauty that sort of undoes our ego's acquisitive, self-interested desire. It could even be an unpredictable encounter with our own mortality, the inevitable certainty of death. It doesn't matter. Whatever the case, it's after having and living through events like these, and they can take years to unfold sometimes. People say, I have seen God. Now, they mean they've been interrupted and overturned by an event. Again, so God is the name of an event, and this event turns us inside out by a process in which we are put into question and challenged at our deepest level. So, in this sense, radical theology is a discourse and a way of being that's designed to keep us in some sense on the edge of this unpredictable sort of limit of experience. It's where I and my world, my regularities and securities are always being made relative and provisional. By the kind of so radical theology wants to expose us to the breaking in on us of what is wholly unmasterable. So whatever it is that shatters our horizon of expectation, whatever it is that makes the world new and makes me a stranger to myself, this is the event that's harboured in the name of God. Okay, now, Jack Caputo's first major theological work, he came out of the closet as a theologian with a book called The Weakness of God. And here he really is taking on what he calls a strong theology, or metaphysical theology, or onto-theology, which is pretty much what theology always is and wants to be. So again, where God is the highest being in the order of presence, where God is the almighty power who presides over being and manifestation. So Jack wants us to stop thinking about God as this supreme being, or as this sort of massive ontological power line that provides power to the world, or believers and so forth. Again, He wants us to instead think of God as something that short circuits, interrupts such power, something that provokes or unsettles the powers that be. And in this sense, Caputo launches a pretty full-on attack on the Christian doctrine of omnipotence, which means the all-powerful aspect or character of God. So this has kind of been understood classically as this interventionist sort of lightning bolt God from above, or the God of kingly rule, almighty sovereign power. We see it in the baptismal creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so forth. In dialogue with the work of Catherine Keller, he takes to task this notion of creation ex nihilo. God created the world out of nothing, out of nothingness. And he sort of shows that there's actually a different reading of Genesis, the creation of text, and suggesting that creation is actually a process or an event that's shot through with uncertainty and contingency, where even God is just sort of rolling the dice, hoping that it works. So that's a pretty, this is an example of a radical reading of a confessional tradition. So he really is trying to suggest that God is not all-powerful, but a weak or powerless force. And weakness here describes the lack of any metaphysical or strong theological sort of force that we assume God is endowed with. So the primary thesis here is that God is a weak or powerless force that nevertheless still lays an unconditional claim or call on our lives. So he sort of very much suspends or rejects the confessions and the creeds as such, as just doctrinal, metaphysical, militant, and so forth. And in their place, he advocates for a weak theology, which is not so much spineless. Instead, it's a robust non-foundationalism. It's a non-fundamentalist testimony to God as a coming event of justice or hospitality or forgiveness or mercy. So the weakness of God is an expression of God's powerlessness, where we give voice to the vulnerable, suffering love of God, in contrast to this almighty warrior who smites all his enemies and so forth. So a weak theology here, or the weakness of God, provides a basis for us to give attention to those regions of powerlessness and helplessness that we tend to hide from in our own lives. It sort of calls us to embrace, again, the difficulty, or what Jack calls the dark ring of ambiguity around life, without the transcendent guarantees, it's risky business. So again, God is not conceived as the rock-solid ground upon which theological sovereignty is erected, but the name of God is systematically associated with the different, the marginal, the outsider, the left out, with the naked ones, the least among us, the destitute, those who are plundered and ground under. So, and this is where we find the more subversive or revolutionary impulse of the weakness of God. God stands for an event that confounds, confuses, contradicts, and scandalises the powers and principalities of this world. So this sort of does bring us back to the radical call that has always been there in Christianity, where there is a kind of a radical undermining of worldly power and so forth. And really this does stem from ultimately what's called a theology of the cross. So Jack's weakness of God is a theology of the cross, which is sort of under, and this is how he unpacks or explicates this underlying logic of divine weakness in terms of an unconditional call without force or sovereignty. And this approach to the cross is a way of crucifying the God of metaphysics, the God of our theological confessions, by giving a critique of their authoritarian, imperialistic effects that we have seen throughout historical Christianity. So he frames this theology of the cross, this weak theology, in and through one of Paul's letters in the New Testament, where Paul speaks about, I proclaim nothing but Christ and him crucified. So this is where we get the logos, or the logic of the cross, where a kind of a helpless human body of a crucified Jesus on a Roman cross here this is the greatest symbol of God's powerless power. As Paul writes, and I'll just quote this: "For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. But God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing the things that are." So this is a foremost example of the weakness of God, a theology of divine weakness. God says that, Paul says that God chose the things that are not to reduce to nothing the things that are. And right here, that's where he really does fly in the face of Greek philosophy and the entire metaphysical tradition. The search for being, the things that are, for what is, that's what constitutes pretty much the Western philosophical tradition stemming from the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. So instead, Paul flaunts the scandal of the cross, where God chooses everything foolish to deconstruct the wisdom of the wise. When the human rule is displaced by the incoming or the rule of God's kingdom, foolishness is favoured over wisdom. Those who God calls upon are not wise or powerful or well-born. Again, so God chooses what is weak to shame the strong. God chooses what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing those who are, have claim to being as such. So this is the key to what's called the kingdom of God in the Synoptic Gospels, which is the central message of the historical flesh and blood Jesus as well. So it's not simply a Pauline theme here. So God chooses the outsiders, the people deprived of wealth and power, education and high birth, high culture. And so the word kingdom is also almost being used ironically in the New Testament here, almost mockingly to refer to the pockets of the despised that infect or infest the world. So again, in the New Testament, we get a kingdom of the low down and the low born, the very people who are precisely the victims of the world's power. So there's a different logic here when it comes to how to unpack the weakness of God. It's not a logic of perfection or excellence. It's a logic of the cross, which crosses out the logos of the world, the logic of metaphysics as the search for being. So Aristotle, Plato and the like, for them logic, or the logos, which is sort of patterned order of things, it's all about staying on top of what's going on around us, knowing how to hit the mark, making every post a winning post, hoping to get lucky with that. On the other hand, Paul's solidarity with those with the nothings and the nobodies, again, this really does scandalise the wisdom of the world as we know it. So being has always had with it the sense of what really and truly is. Philosophy, the search for being is the search for what is. It's about what is permanently present, as opposed to all that's just fleeting and apparent or illusory. So rhetorically, being is always associated with the sun, light, manifestation. And the essence of Greek wisdom is to ascend to the element of being and to avoid this sort of the black hole, the dark corners of non-being, the shifting sands of becoming and so forth. So by choosing what is not, being is interrupted or short-circuited, and God can cross out the distinctions that the wise, the Greek philosophers make between being and non-being, between wisdom and foolishness. So in this sense, God is crossing out the word, or the kingdom, in the sense of the worldly kingdom, the kingdom of, straightforward sense, with a more paradoxical and irregular and ironic kingdom in which which we see the rule of everything that we take for granted is kind of undermined and sort of shattered. So